All right, go for it, Paul.
Good. Welcome, everyone. My name is Paul Garrow. I am Métis from Saskatchewan, and I am a professor, assistant professor in Native Studies at the Faculty of Native Studies in the U of A. I also want to recognize that we are each of us living on and working on Indigenous territories. Here I'm working on Treaty 6 in the Métis homeland. I am very happy and proud to be here and in this space with you. So I just want to welcome everyone to this inaugural CSSR event online through Zoom, and I'm so happy to see so many people here. Today, right now, we are working with David Seljak, Dr. David Seljak, looking at the presentation on religious studies in Canada, CSSR 50 years later. So I would like to either pass it to Sarah or straight to David to see. Straight to David, good, in terms of starting this great conversation. So Marcy, and welcome everyone. Oh, your voice, David, can you hear?
You're muted, dude.
You should be all right now, David. Showing up as unmuted.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Right on.
You hear me now? Thank you, Paul. I would like to, I'm speaking to you from Waterloo and the University of Waterloo, which is on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, specifically the Haldimand Tract, which is promised to the Six Nations. The inspiration for this event was really thinking about the CSSR, which was founded in 1965. So it's the 55th anniversary of the society. It was founded to foster the study of religion, in fact, all world religions. The CSSR joined what was then called the Learned Societies, now called the Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences, that same year. And it was the first religion-focused society, academic society in Canada to do so. And I've been reading Aaron Hughes's new book. He hasn't paid me to hold this up, but I am holding it up for you. From Seminary to University, an Institutional History of the Study of Religion in Canada, in which he argues, in which he outlines the evolution of the study of religion in Canada from one that was based in Christian institutions, specifically theological colleges and seminaries, to the university proper. The previous approach was a Christian approach. It was Christian studies taught by Christians to Christians to make them better Christians, and it was very denominationally based. The main disciplines were theology, church history, and biblical studies. So you can imagine just how the discipline has evolved in an astonishing way in the last 50 years or so. So Paul and I spoke about this, and we decided to invite people to reflect on their experience of the evolution of the discipline in their research and teaching. And to do that, we have invited a number of scholars from across Canada who have been involved in the CSSR. We're not specifically asking them to reflect on how the CSSR has changed their experience of the evolution of the discipline of religious studies, but these are people who were chosen because they have been members of the CSR for a long time. Interestingly, I decided to put the order of speakers in terms of the order in which they joined the society. And so our first speaker today is Bill James of Queen's University, who joined the society in 1974. I would say Bill is our oldest member, but that's no longer politically correct. We'll just say that Bill is chronologically gifted. I believe that's the term that we use these days. So after that, Patricia Dold will speak, who joined the society in 1987, 1 year before I did. I came in 1988. I should say at the prodding of a graduate student I knew at the time, Randy Warren at the University of Toronto, who encouraged me to join and to go to the AGM. I remember that specifically. She said, you have to know how the discipline works as a whole rather than just your little part of it. And that was really good advice. I would give that advice to my graduate students now. And that will be followed by Paul Bramadat of the Patricia Dold of Memorial University in Newfoundland, Paul Bramadat from the University of Victoria, and then finally Ruby Ramji from the University of Cape Breton. So I will be quiet and let Bill start us off.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, and it's very good to be here. I'm retired from Queen's University, where I taught for 35 years in the Religious Studies Department, retired in 2008. And in 1968, I graduated in theology from Queen's, was not wanting to be ordained. I didn't feel I was suited for work in ministry. So I went off to the University of Chicago to do a PhD, began my studies in what was then called theology and literature, and which later became religion and literature. I did my PhD thesis on the Christian epic hero, correlating literary texts with changing views of human excellence in literature. And because most of my American colleagues were working on American subjects, I tried to choose Canadian ones. So I did a number of my larger papers on Hugh MacLennan and Northrop Frye. I came back to Canada in 1972 rather, and spent a year living on a farm writing my PhD thesis. And in 1973 rather, I joined the Religious Studies Department at Queen's University, then under the auspices of the Theological College. I did so with some trepidation because my experience in Chicago was a very liberating one. The atmosphere was very much that portrayed in the trial of the Chicago 7, if you've seen that. And I left a rather stodgy theological seminary in 1968. When I returned in 1973, things had changed vastly. People had been hired with PhDs from Harvard and from Oxford. There were 2 Americans, 1 Brit, and 1 Aussie, and I was the 5th member, and we all taught entirely in religious studies. And these people, rather than being like the stodgy professors I'd left behind in '68, were more like the colleagues and students and professors I encountered at the University of Chicago. And I think what, as I read Bill Arnell's book, I think what occurred to me is that the theological seminary, the church, Christian congregations were themselves undergoing a process of secularization during those years. And so the way in which religion was understood was very much different, even in the early 1970s, than it had been previously. My focus has always been on religion in Canada, and part of my job in the early 70s was to contextualize our religious studies courses into the Canadian scene. And in a way, the Cssr helped me do that. I came back to Canada after 4 years out of the country, didn't know very many Canadian professors, and the Cssr immediately introduced me to people from across the country with whom I was able to affiliate, be mentored by, and converse with. What surprises me now looking back is how many American PhDs were hired into Canadian universities in the late 1960s and early 70s. But even more, how many of them were keen on relating to the Canadian scene? I mean, I think of people like Earl Waugh, who graduated in Islam from the University of Chicago, John Badacher, who graduated in Ethics and Society, Jordan Paper from the University of Wisconsin, Wisconsin and Chinese studies. But all of these people I mentioned went on to write books about religions of First Nations people in Canada. And Earl Waugh, perhaps most notably, has done Cree dictionaries and such, and really was pioneering that. And I found that was not exceptional among my colleagues. They were interested in the Canadian scene, were by no means importing the content of American courses into the situation. As for the CSSR, I did not find it was particularly welcoming to graduate students in the 1970s. In 1973, when I was already back in Ontario writing my thesis, I had no inclination to go to the CSSR meeting, nor any encouragement to do so, even though it was meeting at Queen's University. And so it was only after my first year of teaching at Queen's in 73, 74 that I went to my first CSSR meeting. Of course, it was struggling in those days to be functionally bilingual, or at least participants were encouraged to be passively bilingual. You could speak in your own first language, whether French or English, but you were expected to understand the other language. It took a number of years to discover that did not work well. And it did not work well specifically for the Francophone participants, who discovered that the attendance at their meetings was rather low. And so understandably, and I think with encouragement from the CSSR, they very much went their own way. Certainly, I would say that the courses that I taught and the courses taught by my colleagues were by no means ever taught from some kind of faith perspective, or with the program or agenda somehow inculcating a form of Christianity. When the late Harold Remus and I now paid tribute to Harold Remus, who passed away in the last year, when we were doing the state-of-the-art review in Ontario, one of the questions we asked was about the bias of religious studies professors. And the question came down to something like this: you have to have certain assumptions in order to feel at home in the classroom in religious studies courses. And the answer we got was, that might be true in some departments of sociology, or some courses in women's studies, or if you took Native studies, but in fact, the opposite is often true in religious studies courses. If you go into the religious studies course expecting your faith to be somehow bolstered or strengthened, the effort of the professor was often seen to be unsympathetic to that kind of building up of religious faith. What else has changed? I would say that many of the courses in the 1970s were taught in a dialogical kind of way. That is, they were religion and courses. Religion and literature, which is my specialty, religion and ethics, religion and something else. And those thematic courses by about 1980 had very much become more emphasized on traditions, and the thematic courses fell into the background. By the late 1980s, it was possible in most universities to take more advanced courses in specific traditions rather than a single intro course to Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam. I'm going to just skip over some things now and highlight perhaps some most notable features. One thing has not changed in the years that I've been associated with religious studies in Canada, and that is the question of defining religion is still very much in the forefront. On the other hand, field studies have become more important in preference to studying religion out of texts. The human experience of religion has become significant, and until we began to have to do more and more complicated ethics reviews, it was welcoming to see the growth of field studies courses in the 1980s and 90s. Now pause, how am I doing for time? I can stop here or I can continue. Any advice?
You're at the 7-minute mark.
Okay, I'll stop, and in the discussion, maybe I'll get a chance to throw in some more things.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we did. Unfortunately, you can't hear our applause, Bill. So anyway, then we will. We did ask people for about 5 to 7 minutes of reflection so that we would have time for group discussion. And so Pat from Memorial is up next.
Thanks. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for being here. It's really interesting, some contrast between Bill's experiences and mine, but anyway, we can talk about that later. So my own background is Roman Catholic, born, raised, and schooled in the Roman Catholic tradition, but I was drawn to religious studies by the sheer audacity of thinking about religion. The practice of questioning and studying religion for me really was a transformation of the power dynamics as I had known them in relation to religion, very different from what I had absorbed at home and in my school years. So since those school years, over the past 43 years, I'm surprised to say, I have been part of religious studies at 4 different institutions, as an undergrad, then graduate student, as a sessional instructor for 13 years, and now as a member of the faculty at Memorial for the past 17. As I look back, I'm struck by the diverse composition of the 4 departments and the different trajectories that each has followed. Some departments, for example, clearly had more of an emphasis on having representatives of traditions or people who belong to certain traditions as faculty. Another example of the 4 departments, only one, the department at McMaster, remains fully independent and offers the full slate of degree programs. All 3 others have seen challenges to departmental status and independence. In one case, the University of Alberta, those challenges affected various department configurations beginning already in the early 1990s. The challenge of establishing and maintaining curriculum on Asian traditions, which is my area, Hindu traditions specifically, has been very clear throughout these 43 years. I remember David Kinsley speaking to this to the department at McMaster, despite the fact that there were between 5 and 8 tenured faculty teaching in Asian religions. By the time I arrived at the University of Alberta in 1995, there was no longer any tenured or tenure line professor teaching Asian religious traditions full-time. Eva Neumeier was still there, but she was occupied with administration. Here at Memorial, my arrival in 2004 added only a second tenure line Asian religious studies, Asian religions appointment to the department. And after a decade of attrition budgeting and a 50% reduction in our faculty complement, I am about to be the only person specializing in any Asian religious tradition. To be sure, resistance to internationalization of curriculum and the academy has not been equal in strength in all contexts that I have encountered, but it remains ubiquitous even as universities and governments talk internationalization and intensify recruitment of students in Asia, in Africa, and elsewhere. I cannot help but think here of the struggles too of the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute to maintain funding from both the Indian and Canadian governments, and the almost complete erosion of its support for humanities disciplines and fine arts disciplines, though its stated mission is still about sharing knowledge and culture between India and Canada. Even so, and after departments and programs of religious studies, in my experience, had largely made the case for religious studies as an academic discipline distinct from theology, in my experience, that was a battle that was largely over by the time I started, even as an undergrad. There remained and remains a struggle to liberate religious studies from what I'm calling here, for lack of better terminology, dominant Christian Anglo-European modes of scholarship. When I reflect on, for example, the number of courses on Hindu traditions at the University of Calgary's programs from the 80s through the 90s, and they're still there in the present, and also the number of faculty specializing on South Asian religions at McMaster back in my day, I recognize that we have had a great deal of success in pluralizing religious studies as a discipline. And of course, this pluralizing has also included new and alternative religions, a broader range of religions of the world, not just so-called world religions, as well as religion in the arts, religion in popular culture, and so on. And here I think we've gone through a bit of a, the pendulum swinging back and forth, given what you were saying, Bill, about those courses once having been quite prominent and then receding in favor of traditions courses. Now it seems perhaps there's a resurgence of the religion and sorts of cultures. Indeed, we see now many religion and culture departments rather than departments of religious studies, defining the presence of the discipline or the field on Canadian campuses. These shifts happened later here at Memorial than elsewhere. Oops. Sorry. These shifts, happened later here at Memorial than elsewhere, in part because, though founded as religious studies rather than theology, the department established here in 1968 began with the appointment of 3 Christian clergy, and then developed its curriculum around Christianity and Bible. A decisive push to pluralize and achieve greater balance in the program here did not really happen until 2003 to 2004. And the department now is radically different than it was then, in more ways than one. It is now more religion and culture than religious texts and traditions. Returning to the field of religious studies more broadly again, the content of this more pluralistic religious studies curriculum and discipline has been radically transformed, I would say, by the feminization of the academy and of religious studies in particular, as well as the general intensification of critical scholarly studies of power. In religious studies, we were giving and are giving increasing attention to lived religion, more attention to ritual, festival, pilgrimage, to performance traditions, to vernacular and modern media expressions. There are courses on traditions defined not by historical periods, as was once the case, but by categories and orientations from within different traditions. Our curriculum and our scholarship attend to a broader range of voices, women's voices, as well as to silences in texts, exclusions from practices, voices about iniquity and resistances, diasporas as religious communities rather than fringes. In these ways, too, religious studies has accomplished something of a liberation of the discipline from its earlier Christian Anglo-European rules and assumptions, including the myth of objectivity. Back in my undergrad days, we studied the ideals of religious traditions almost exclusively, and almost exclusively, these ideals were taught to us by white male scholars on the basis of texts largely authored by and for males, institutions led by males. And these were, I remember, certain beloved professors of mine saying these were the right things to study. Also, as a religious studies undergrad at Calgary, I had courses from one tenured female prof and one sessional professor. Both were disproportionately influential in my subsequent career. So along with pluralizing, there has been some democratizing, universalizing, de-essentializing. All of these changes in religious studies are also reflected in the shift in the interdisciplinarity of religious studies. It seems to me we were once very much at home with disciplines like philosophy and philology, perhaps also history. but now there's a very thorough engagement with disciplines like sociology, anthropology, gender studies, political science. Such de-essentializing and multidisciplinarity is, to quote Paul Garreau, amazing, but most of these developments are happening in other fields too, which for me raises the question, why do we need religious studies? I think religious studies survival requires us to have good answers to that question. I, for one, I'm going to end a little bit bizarrely, am brushing up on my Sanskrit while also figuring out how to be useful to survivors of sexual abuse by clergy in Roman Catholic institutions. The end.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. And so now we move on to Paul Bramadat.
All right, thanks, David, and thanks, Paul, for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's lovely to see some old friends and some graduate students. I'm really pleased to see all of you turning out today. Thanks. So I'm going to give you kind of like two snapshots, one of kind of where I started in my academic career in Winnipeg, and then now where I've been for the last 12 years. So I spent 10 years at the University of Winnipeg in their religious studies department between 1998 and 2008. By that time, the department had undergone kind of a complete renewal of the three core faculty who were in place when I was an undergrad in that same department between 1985 and 1990. Now, when I was there as a student, the professors were all religious studies scholars, but also ordained ministers. And I always felt that they distinguished quite well between religious studies and theology. That's where I really learned about the tension and the distinction between the two modes of thinking and writing. When I became a professor in the department in 1998, after finishing my PhD at Mac in the same year, there were four of us, a Hebrew Bible scholar, a Buddhist studies scholar, an indigenous spirituality scholar, and me. I was kind of the modern Western religion guy, I guess. My training at Mac was in the social scientific study of religion, but the kinds of questions I asked were really, I think, at home in either what I think of as the humanities or the social sciences. At the U of W, I witnessed the growing pains of religious studies that I think many of you have seen and that have already been talked about, especially vis-a-vis the question of hirings, right? So we had a difficulty hiring an Islamic studies colleague, and we also struggled to regularize the hire of a colleague in indigenous spirituality. In the first case, in the Islamic studies area, we were looking for an Islamicist right after the aftermath of 9/11. And that meant we struggled to attract somebody who was both really strong because they could go to pretty much any university they wanted, and somebody who wouldn't freak out as soon as winter arrived and flee back to the United States, where most of them came from. In the second case, in the case of the indigenous studies hire, we faced strong internal pressure to hire an indigenous person to teach in that area. But in that arena too, at that time, it was very hard to find a strong cohort of applicants who were indigenous and who were approaching the study of religion and spirituality in an appropriate religious studies kind of way. Anyway, those hiring experiences taught me a great deal, which we can maybe talk about in as we tease things out a bit. But things changed dramatically when I left in 2008, left Winnipeg to lead the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at the University of Victoria, which is a position I've held since 2008. Now, what's unusual about the CSRS is, well, pretty much everything. For one thing, the center was started in 1991, almost a decade before there were any religious studies courses at UVic, which is kind of weird. As some of you may know, that usually when you start a research center, it kind of grows out of a large PhD program where they recognize that, hey, there's a real strength in such and such an area, and let's have a research center. It happened exactly the opposite at UVic, where we started the center, and then people said, hey, maybe we should have a regular BA in religious studies. So the center was started because we received a large gift, a large donation, which is now our endowment, which is $6.5 million. And the university hired Harold Coward as the inaugural director. And the university provided the space. So we now have a whole wing of a building and about space for about 20 colleagues. And we also have our own administrative space and a kitchen, and a library where we meet every day. Now, the university committed to supporting a full-time director role. I'm the third, and that faculty member would have a place in the regular department and be sort of seconded to the CSRS. I'm officially lodged in the history department for reasons that are too complicated to explain and which remain shrouded in mystery even to me. Now, the endowment paid for the staff as well as the fellowships that we would offer to grad students and faculty members. The fellowship holders get a private office with your own little herd of deer. I'm actually not really kidding there. And $6,000. And perhaps most valuably, I think, you get access to a thriving academic and social space at the CSRS. And I might not have mentioned this, but we don't really have winter in Victoria. So, I mean that seriously. Like when I arrived, I discovered that their academic terms are called summer, fall, and spring. Now, I'm from Winnipeg, and when I learned about the summer, fall, spring structure, I told the dean at that time, it was Andrew Rippon, I said, you know, that's why people hate you. You know that, right? Anyway, in addition to the director, we have a program coordinator, the always superb Rachel Brown, who's with us today. We have a research affiliate, we have an administrative assistant, and usually we have a work study student, and sometimes an assistant who might be attached to one of our research projects. As it turns out, religion is actually quite a central theme of many of the scholars at UVic, though these colleagues work in the faculty of law, they work in history, anthropology, English, political science, philosophy, fine arts, and so forth. I won't go through their names, but they are kind of all the major leaders that you would imagine in the Canadian arena. As well, since Vancouver Island is a preferred retirement destination, we have a good cohort of non-UVic people who are now living on the island and who remain academically active. People like Victor Horry, Catherine Young, Francis Landy, Jordan Paper, Robert Florida, Erica Dodd, to name just a few. We also try to have, as associate fellows, members of what we now, of course, call precarious, right? People who are finished their PhDs, but haven't found kind of the next thing to do in life, whether that's to become a professor or to think about something else. And we kind of create a space where those folks can reimagine their professional careers. In addition, part of the director's job is to build bridges with the religious communities, government partners, and NGO reps in the broader region, as well as with religious studies colleagues in other universities in Canada and around the world. So I spend quite a lot of my time building networks and inviting people and finding ways to introduce people to people they wouldn't otherwise meet. That's one of the most enjoyable parts of my job, for sure. Then there are people we bring in from abroad for the special lectures, and we have funds to bring in special lecturers and create workshops and so forth. I won't burden you with to their names, but they're all the fancy people from all the fancy places. Just have to trust me. Including, I should add, Noam Chomsky, who's probably the fanciest person who came. Most recently, he came in February. Moreover, the center undertakes major interdisciplinary research projects using a model that was initiated by the founding director, Harold Coward, and carried on by me. These have been really central activities for us for decades and have always focused on issues of scholarly and public concern, from palliative care to radicalization to vaccine hesitancy to urban religiosity to Cascadian bioregionalism, which is one of our most recent books that Sarah and I co-edited. UVic started a minor program in religious studies in about 2005 and then made that into a major program in 2008 after I arrived. And it was then and still is a small but I think pretty agile interdisciplinary program with about 4 faculty members offering courses. And that includes Rachel. The CSRS and Religion, Culture, and Society, the research center and the program have different staff, different funding sources. They're located in different buildings and they operate according to different governance principles and documents and policies. But what the endowment means, really, the endowment that the center has, it means that the CSRS is somewhat immune from what happens in the RCS program. Of course, it's in the interest of the center and also in my own interest to make sure the program flourishes. But in theory, our mandates are quite different, so we're somewhat insulated. That said, the mandates are aligned, at least in the sense that both the program and the center are meant to be bastions of religious studies in the same sort of narrative tradition that Bill was tracing. In the case of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, we do engage much more often and much more directly with members of local and national religious communities. Still, even in those conversations, Rachel and I try to model the way religious studies scholars might productively, critically, and respectfully engage in collaborations with so-called insiders. Now, the question of how to do that best always depends to a large degree on what community we're talking about. Are we talking about Anglicans, Indigenous folks, or Ismailis? In all cases, we try to be mindful of the vested interests at work in the ways each community might approach us or might, accept our invitation to be involved in collaboration. These conversations have taught me more than I could ever imagine about the ways religion is lived, the ways secularity is imagined and policed, and the ways we are all engaged in this ongoing interpretive process. I really think of the CSSR as an important home for the approach to religion that we see at the CSRS and at the program that I'm a part of. And so I'm very pleased to be part of the conversation. Thanks, everybody. And I'm sorry if that sounded a bit too kind of promotional, but I strongly encourage all of you to come and hang out with us at the center. I know David's basically a permanent member of the center. Sarah is as well. Bill James has been around. So you're all welcome to come out and hang out with us. Okay, thanks.
Paul, for those remarks. And now we have Ruby Ramji. No, I'm reluctant. I don't know who could hang a name on her, but she got it. All right, go.
I used to use Ruby Tuesday, and so I'd have so many people go, "Who's that?" And I had to realize I was old, so I had to change. I'm going to talk a little bit about my history and also my role in the CSSR, because I got to see it change quite a bit, I believe, in the last 20 years. My family came to Canada as refugees, and so the idea of education for children was extremely important. And so going to university was a requirement. South Asian child growing up in Canada, you're supposed to make the best of everything. And getting a PhD was considered to be the be all and end all, in a sense. It was like, if you're not going to be a doctor or an engineer, at least have a really good education that you can get a job. So I thought a PhD would get me an awesome job. Not so. I ended up coming into religious studies actually via psychology. So I did a psych degree, and then I did psychology of religion, and then I did sociology of religion. And I realized that the money should have been in psychology and not in the religion part. I should have stayed in the first half. But when I got to my PhD university, which was the University of Ottawa, I was actually first introduced to the American Academy of Religion. And so that's actually where I started doing my administrative work, in a sense. I became a member of a committee there, and I didn't know anything about the CSSR really until I met Peter Beyer. And so he was the one who said, this is a place where you can meet your Canadian colleagues and start talking to other people that you don't know. And so the first CSSR I went to was amazing. I didn't realize the amount of work that was being done by graduate students and faculty in Canada when it came to religious studies. I basically was doing my PhD during 9/11. So I got to see a lot of the backlash. I got to see the Islamophobia, and I got to see how religious studies faculty basically, picked up the mantle of trying to fight Islamophobia. And to me, that was an amazing thing. And so that became a large part of my focus, was the portrayal of Islam in North American mass media and how it was dealt with. And so the people that I were meeting, the graduate students more than anyone else, were really pushing for this idea of changing the way not just religious studies was, but the society itself as becoming less fighting colonialism, in a sense, fighting Eurocentrism, and trying to look at it from a much broader perspective, looking at how religion focuses on society, the social impact of religion. And so this was becoming a new thing to unfold and bring out. And so I was really glad to have found the CSSR. And then I met Paul Bramadat, who said, you should run for a position. And I said, I'm a graduate student. I can't be on the executive. And he's like, well, come to the meeting and see what happens. And of course, on the floor, he nominated me. And so I had no choice because I was the only one whose name was put out for member at large. And I became a member of the executive. And I was actually very, very welcomed. I did not expect to have that much welcome from senior scholars. They were more than happy to include me into the executive. And basically because of my entering into it, the executive itself started to look at how it could support graduate students on a bigger level than it had in the past. And so one of the things that happened was that I believe it was in 2003, the first ad hoc graduate student member at large position was created. And I believe it was Chris Cutting, who was actually our first graduate student member at large. And that became a very important aspect of the CSSR. All of a sudden, we now had communication between different departments and students in different departments and what they were working on and what they wanted to do. And so all of a sudden, the idea of incorporating all of that research and momentum in what was happening after 9/11, and the entire push of looking for different ways of understanding religion really came to the forefront, looking at how graduate students were researching this. And so it became a center, in a sense, for a place where a lot of graduate students would come to present their research and talk to other students and faculty to make it basically a much more collegial experience for all of us, students as well as faculty. We ended up having more graduate students presenting in sessions. I think at one point in time, we had something like 30% were graduate students presenting. We were seeing that faculty were coming out and were interested in what students were actually talking about. It wasn't just faculty going to see faculty and students going to see students. And it became a much more, I want to say, open and inviting place for graduate students, not just for those who wanted to get jobs in religious studies, but also those who couldn't, because the field of religious studies in universities was declining. There were less and less jobs. When I graduated, I actually worked for the federal government for 6 years. I was one of the first who basically walked away from academia. And then I got a postdoc. And so basically that kind of pulled me back in. And I got a job at the University of Cape Breton University in Sydney, Nova Scotia, which is the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. And I work and play at the pleasure of the unceded territory. But at the same time, Cape Breton University built its religious studies program out of philosophy. The two philosophers who created the program were priests. And so I walked into a very heavily theological department. But it turned out that the two priests were retired actually just before I got there. So I was the only person in religious studies. And I've been at Cape Breton University since 2006, and I am still the only religious studies faculty member there in the Department of Religious Studies. So even though it felt like a step forward for Cape Breton University, it stalled. And what happened in other places is that it diminished. And so we're seeing programs now becoming part of other departments and becoming more fragmented. And this in itself has become extremely problematic for graduate students because they're also looking for their spaces. Where are they going to fall and where do they fit in? And so I see CSSR still playing an extremely important role in graduate students' lives because it does give us that place where we can come together and talk about new areas of study that have basically become a mainstay in the last 10 years, where we're talking about ethnography and Indigenous studies and, new religions and, new religions in Canada, even per se, identity, diversity, pluralism. These are all ideas that have really become mainstays of Canadian society. And so I believe that religious studies can play a very large role outside of the academic area. And I think that the CSSR is doing a good job of looking at that. Not always the best, but we do have more and more sessions about how, people with a PhD can actually find jobs in other areas. We've got people who are looking at heritage policy, immigration, education. And so I think that the CSSR can become more of a central area in terms of looking at how we can engage the public. It doesn't mean that we can only do it as faculty, that we can do it in so many different ways. And I think that we need to give that idea to graduate students, that there are many ways that we can engage in so many different areas of society. Thanks.
You must have timed that perfectly. It was exactly at the 7-minute mark. As I have posted in the chat, if you wish to ask a question, just put your name in and I'll keep a speakers list. We have about 15 minutes, and so I'll open the floor to Q&A right now.
Randy.
May I speak?
Randy.
Okay.
Yes, Randy.
Yeah, I'm going to challenge some of this narrative, and it's interesting to me. Well, history is written by the people who are actively articulating the history. I have been a member of the Cssr since '79, and I was on the executive for about a decade. And as my comment says, how you change a field is through institutional redefinition. There was a lot of opposition along the way to bringing graduate students in. And David, you may remember some of those early struggles back even in the 80s, where it was felt it would lower the intellectual tone of this society to allow the mongrels in, the bits and pieces. If they didn't want to, this was partly the shift to traditions, I guess, where people who were textual scholars with other linguistic skills were seen as more accomplished in a scholarly way than folks like Bill James or myself, religion in Canada, popular culture. I've always done religion and culture, and maybe later on in another conversation here, I can speak a bit more about that because I have a question to you folks. But I just find it interesting how history rewrites itself, that you have a movement and then the wave recedes and then you come back and it's a new discovery for graduate students. I guess I just want to say that that was a key part of what I tried to do in the many years that I was on the executive, and I'm really pleased to see that happening in a lively way in a new iteration.
Randy, I think you might have been the first person to put forward the idea of a graduate student member at large.
Yep.
Because I looked back at the minutes to see when it came in, and I know that there was a lot of discussion, and I saw your name very specifically. So I thank you very much for starting that discussion.
Well, get the people in the in the tent, right? You have to have the voices in the tent, and David knows this from way back. But the liveliness of the field depends on the freshness and energy of whoever is bringing their concerns to it, and that you can be ancient and you can be a baby student and you can be always in between, but it has to always be fresh. The conversations always have to be fresh. So I'm going to put this in people's minds and not talk about it more now, but I'm in cultural studies. I've built a cultural studies program. There are reasons why religious studies didn't work at university at Mount St. Vincent, partly to do with philosophy, partly it doesn't matter, politics. But I want to build a cultural studies, religious studies department back again. We've got a defunct religious studies department. So I'd like to know if I can call on you folks later as I'm pitching this to our administration to take our non-departmental cultural studies program and take the defunct religious studies department and make a credible unit, and whether the CSSR would be supportive of that. And I could call upon you for confirmation that it is academically worthy.
Thank you, Randy. I have a question now. Rachel Brown has put her name up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this. It's so great to hear kind of about the history, which is I've read lots about, but it's fun to hear the actual voices that are often referenced to actually tell the story. So thank you for that. I'm wondering, because a lot of the conversations that we have at the CSRS and that I have with colleagues who have graduated in the last, 5 years, like myself, I'm wondering if things have changed, because the way that, in terms of the job market and in terms of the religious studies, kind of the field and the departments and the programs across the country, folks like me and my colleagues and friends, our story is there are no jobs. There are no jobs. There's nowhere for us to go. We all worked so hard, do good work, and we literally can't get jobs. And then we're told by oftentimes more chronologically gifted scholars that it's always been that way. It's always been hard to get a job. Is that true, friends, or has it changed?
I don't know if anyone's been keeping tabs on the ratio between, PhDs entering the market and, opportunities for them in the academy. So I don't know how to answer that. I do know when I was your age, that the refrain that I heard at the CSSR and everywhere else was that, oh, well, you should prepare to sell shoes or raise some kids or teach part-time in the various, universities in your neighborhood. That was sort of the assumption that I had about what my life was going to be like. And then I kind of feel like I lucked out. I'm not sure what the rest of you feel.
I feel like I lucked out. Absolutely. I think one of the bigger challenges that has come up over and over again, and I think Randy kind of made it succinct, but how do we feel about taking a defunct religious studies program and adding it with culture? It's like so many religious studies programs have become defunct or have become smaller due to attrition. Basically, if people retire, they're not replacing those positions to fill them again. And they're merging religious studies with other programs, with classics, with philosophy, with history. And so there are just less religious studies positions out there. So I totally agree with Rachel. It's much worse now. I would say that half of them are gone. Every time someone retires, you'll see that position doesn't come up. So for I would say every 3 retirements, maybe 1 gets replaced. And I think that's the biggest problem. And I think that at the end of the day, that is a reflection of how universities see the role of religious studies in society as not important in comparison to other programs.
I think also it's how universities themselves are struggling to survive, and arts and social science programs overall. I mean, I've been in all kinds of places, in all kinds of positions. I worked for the United Church. I've worked for, I spent 3 years in Wisconsin doing a women's studies program. I came back and hired into a Catholic program where I was supposed to teach catechism, and I knew nothing about that. I guess what I'd say is, how is the institution itself functioning, and how is it prioritizing? How is the institution prioritizing critical thinking about the culture? What I see more and more is an attempt to instrumentalize, get distance courses in, pull them in, throw them out. It's a vending machine. Is that what is happening elsewhere?
I can just imagine Randy teaching catechism courses and teaching your students that it's not considered premarital sex if you have no intention of getting married. That's probably the way she taught it, probably why she wasn't kept in this position for very long. My own experience with regards to the job market, we have a small doctoral program joint with Laurier at the University of Waterloo. And of the people that have graduated, about the national average of people who come in graduate, which is in Canada about 55% of doctoral candidates. And then the number of people who get job, it's about the national average, maybe a little bit better. But I think of all of our graduates who have gotten full-time jobs, only one is in a department of religious studies. Sociology, contemporary studies, global studies, but only one is actually in a department of religious studies. As a 3, Rachel, Okay, Rachel is, I'm sorry, I'm talking about University of Waterloo part of the graduates, but you're right, 3 people overall because of Amar and I'm blanking, Xavier. Yeah, thank you. But anyway,
Diane?
the great majority are teaching outside of religious studies.
Diana has a question, David. When you're
Diana,
ready.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much to all for your really insightful talks and completely resonate with our experiences. I just want to briefly say that, I came to the CSSR maybe in 2013 and 14, like through a conference, and I found it really exciting. And now I've been a member of the executive committee for a year. So thanks to Ruby and everyone else, it was a very, very welcoming experience. But what I'm wondering, talking about the problems we have in religious studies, job market and all that, whether the situation with our departments is not in that kind of condition, because maybe we do not truly reflect a Canadian society, like thinking of what Patricia said, and maybe in a way Ruby, like Asian studies is marginalized. I mean, Islamic studies may be marginalized. We still have maybe the predominance of certain fields. But if we look around, at Canadian society, it's so diverse, it's so pluralistic, and the place of Indigenous people and all that peoples. So I think if our courses maybe better reflected, or our appointments better reflected, what is going on in society, and if we emphasize the element on culture, not just religion, maybe that would be like you said, of course, fully agree. I think there'll be, more students coming to our classes and eventually more jobs. Universities could not be blind if there would be, let's say, 50 or 60 students in our classes. So sooner or later, this will lead to further appointments. So I know it's very complex, but yeah, if we do not reflect, if we do not the needs of society, if we do not kind of correspond to the expectations of students, then it's a conversation among us, and yeah, we'll be missing out on a great opportunity, I think. Thanks.
Does anyone wish to respond? Panelists?
Can I say something?
Please, Patricia.
So I think that part of our battle right now is the kind of ethos that exists at universities, and where there's increasingly this emphasis on pragmatic outcomes, and those disciplines and schools and faculties that really train people for a job market, either the job market that we know now or the one that is coming in the future that we don't know so well, but we're still, right? Absolutely, it's the whole neoliberal agenda, and the whole, the kind of language that universities use now, that university administrators use, no offense intended, but probably going to offend somebody, that we're supposed to be entrepreneurial and identify specific outcomes, and have our strategic goals aligned with everything that we do, and so on and so forth. We recently at Memorial, we managed to achieve what we really consider to be a huge victory by having a paragraph added to the current the strategic plan that's being written right now, a paragraph that actually talks about, cultivating knowledge, generating and sharing knowledge and critical skills, and defending and maintaining academic freedom. But it was a battle to get, we won the battle, but it was a battle to get that included in a university's strategic plan. But I think that it falls to all of us, and particularly, I include myself absolutely here, to fight this fight. We are in positions that enable us to speak to our administrators and to continually press them on, what we understand to be the core of the university. What is a university supposed to be about? Is it a vocational school, or is it a place for the free, unrestricted generation and sharing of knowledge. And we've got to make, and I think this is a point that we need to be making continually, not just within our institutions, to our administrators, to our colleagues, but also to the general public, where we have, we have the boon of social media. Let's use it to, use it more so. I realize a lot of people have been doing this throughout their entire careers, but, to really double down on those efforts to educate people about what it is that we do and why values, why the university is an important institution for society. Thank you very much.
We are at 12, but I think we'll extend the session by another 9 minutes because people are really engaged, and I'd hate to cut off the discussion at this point. I saw it's very difficult for me actually to keep up with the chat that's going on, so I know that people are very much engaged. I just wanted to say something about the job market and the academic job market. And that is, when I was doing my dissertation at McGill University it was a sociology of religion, and my topic was Quebec, in fact. So that's how I defined myself on the job market. There was one position, I did my dissertation, I did sessional teaching. It was an 8-year, almost 9-year period. There was one position that was in my area in that whole time, and it went to that son of a bitch, Peter Beyer at the University of Ottawa, who, okay, I'm going to say now, is a much better scholar than I am. So that's deserved. But when I was ready to finish my dissertation, my teaching, there was a position in religion in Canada, religion in the social sciences, every year for 8 years. So just by luck, if I had graduated earlier, I would have graduated into the void. But just because of the timing of when I graduated, there was a position in my area every year in 8 years. So it was almost inevitable that I would get a position. I'm not saying I was the smartest guy studying the sociology of religion in Canada, but I think I was in the top 9. At least there are only 9 of us. So I just want to point out, it really is a matter, there are elements that you cannot control. And the difference between someone who's working their way sessionally, course by course, and a full-time professor is a matter of luck, timing, and of course you have to have the necessary qualifications. But really, I was the same person. Had I graduated in 1990 versus 96, it would have been a very different experience for me. So there was some very good exchange between Joel Thiessen and Michael Wilkinson. I'm sorry if I put you guys on the spot about the kind of the role of secularization theory in the university's thinking about religious studies as a discipline. I wonder if we might pick up some of that and engage others with it.
I was just commenting on Joel's observation that I've heard these similar sentiments, from some sociology colleagues at other departments, that there's little demand for religion. And if religion is declining and disappearing, why would we spend all this money to hire a full-time specialist in the sociology of religion, for example? But that's also tied with, a conversation around the demand for areas like sociology of health, immigration, other areas that are just, further up the agenda for importance, and religion gets moved down to the bottom. And so this is one reason why, for myself, I always had to sell myself as doing something other than just religion. And so globalization theory, migration, those kinds of topics, become the way in which you kind of sell yourself along with religion, and why I've been in a sociology department. But I also wanted to say that narrative about secularization, I have some questions about it, because I don't think it's solely that. There's also, like at Trinity, you would think, oh, everybody must be interested in taking religious studies courses. Our religious studies department is in trouble. Like, no one is majoring in it. Students don't want to take courses, not even courses in, theology or any courses in biblical studies or anything like that. There's a general, I think, kind of narrative that you need to take a program that's going to get you a job. And so our business department, School of Business is booming. School of Nursing, booming. School of Education, booming. Anything that's professional studies, that's where things are booming. And the narrative is take programs that get you jobs. Parents are telling that to kids. Those programs are booming. And that's the same even at Trinity, which, people assume is a religious school. So everybody's studying religion and, loves religion and wants to study religion, but that's not even the case at Trinity. Students don't want to take a single or another religion course. They want to get a degree that's going to get them a job.
I think we are facing a new cohort. I've been reading another excellent book by this one by Dold.
Yes, David.
Sarah, and welcome to applause. Now that about 50% of young Canadians, define themselves as being without religion, it's not that they're anti-religious or anti-institution. They've just never experienced religion, and so we may as well be. I don't know. Why would they take a course in religious studies if they don't know what it is? So I think we have to teach and administer differently. Anyway, there's a wonderful roundtable session on this excellent book, and I put that in the chat.
David, one thing that interests me in observing these conversations since the late 80s, early 90s, is that, conversations about the plight or the fate or the future of religious studies always reflect what's going on in the broader culture. So when you and I in the early 2000s were getting into the questions around ethnicity and public policy and so forth, the argument there was that, this was also in the wake of 9/11. The idea there was that, look, there's lots of stuff we need to know about religious diversity and how that relates to the Canadian state and immigration policy and so forth. And then radicalization became an interest. And so right now, it seems like, although I think only Patricia has mentioned it once, that the kind of neoliberal critique of the value or the purpose of the university seems to be the elephant in the room here, right? That people are principally concerned because they hear their parents' voices in the back of their heads about getting a job and so forth. So the idea about how to sell and this is picking up on Michael's comment, like how to sell yourself in a way that you're not just the religion person, you are the person interested in broad social, cultural, political processes that occur in religion, but also occur in hiring practices, in foreign conflicts, in economic policy and so forth. And so you can kind of go to any of those topics. And really, like the work we do at the CSRS is work that begins with that assumption that the problem is that the traditional training of religious studies scholars to be like the world's expert on this little tiny group or this one metaphor and this one text, and that actually isn't going to fly anymore unless you can say that you have a broad set of questions and curiosities that you're addressing in your work. You can guarantee that you're not going to get hired, because why would a university have an interest in you doing just that one text, the one metaphor, the one figure, the one little group? They're not interested in that. And so I'm not saying that's not valuable work still. I'm just saying, that the question is, what is the broader kind of cultural, political backdrop against which we're trying to define the purpose and the current state of religious studies? But it's always reflective over these broader things.
So just to jump in here, there's lots of great comments in the chat. The chat's going to stay open this whole day, and hopefully we'll have lots of opportunities to continue this discussion. Before we wrap up the session, David, I just have a couple of announcements. So one way of continuing this discussion will be in the next session at 12:15 for all grad students. You're welcome to join us, all about navigating the job market these days. And so we'll talk about some of these realities and others. And at 12:15 Eastern Daylight Time. And then also at the end of the conference, at the end of the day on the 2nd of June, we're going to have another session where we look forward, 50 years forward, the CSSR, religious studies, what does it look like? So we have another set of great speakers coming up, so we can keep going with this discussion. I also like to announce the annual general meeting for the CSSR on the 10th of June. I've put the details kind of at the start of the chat today. And so if you want to be part of the CSSR, get involved, come join us for that Zoom meeting, which will be great to see many of you there. And also later on today, we've got our plenary session on decolonizing urgency. That's at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And so please join us for that as well. David?
Thank you so much, Sarah. And again, thank you to Paul for co-organizing this session, Paul Garot. And I have posted the timing of the continuation of this conversation on June 2nd. So we hope to see you all there. Anyway, thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.